Chief Detective Marcus Rodriguez had seen it all in his 23 years on the force, but nothing quite prepared him for what awaited him in his own backyard that sweltering July evening. The bass-heavy music hit him like a physical wall as he pulled into his driveway after a grueling 14-hour shift investigating a string of break-ins across the upscale Millbrook neighborhood. His modest two-story home sat quietly in the middle-class section of town, a deliberate choice he'd made years ago to stay connected to the community he served rather than retreating to the gated enclaves where many of his colleagues lived. The pounding rhythm wasn't coming from his house. It was coming from behind it. Marcus killed the engine and sat for a moment, his weathered hands still gripping the steering wheel. At 52, he'd earned every gray hair threading through his dark hair and every line etched around his brown eyes. He'd worked his way up from beat cop to detective to chief through sheer determination and an unwavering commitment to justice, earning respect even from those who initially doubted whether someone from his working-class background could handle the pressures of leadership in their affluent community. The music grew louder as he approached his back gate, accompanied now by the unmistakable sounds of teenagers shouting and splashing. His blood pressure spiked as the reality hit him. Someone was using his pool, his private fenced backyard that he'd spent 5 years saving up to landscape and outfit with a modest above-ground pool that had become his sanctuary after long days dealing with entitled complainants and complicated cases. Through the slats of his wooden fence, Marcus caught glimpses of movement, bright bikinis, tanned bodies, and expensive smartphones glinting in the late afternoon sun. A Bluetooth speaker the size of a suitcase sat perched on his patio table, pumping out music that could probably be heard 3 blocks away. Empty beer bottles and red Solo cups littered his carefully maintained lawn, and what looked like pizza boxes were stacked on his outdoor furniture. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, pulling out his phone to record the scene before confronting the trespassers. 20 years of police work had taught him to document everything. As he pushed through his own back gate, the party came into full view. At least 15 teenagers were scattered around his property, with half a dozen actually in his pool. They were clearly from money. Their casual clothes probably cost more than most people's monthly car payments, and the casual way they treated his space suggested they were used to having the finest things handed to them without consequence. "Excuse me," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect in courtrooms and crisis situations. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" The music continued blaring as most of the teens ignored him completely, a few glances away with the kind of dismissive look usually reserved for unwanted solicitors. One girl, clearly the ringleader based on how the others deferred to her, barely looked up from her Instagram story as she responded with breathtaking arrogance. "Chill out, old man. We're just having some fun. It's not like you were using it." She flipped her blonde hair and turned back to her phone as if his presence was merely a minor inconvenience. Marcus felt his jaw clench. In all his years of dealing with difficult people, he'd rarely encountered such casual disrespect. But something about this girl's voice, her entitled manner, and her complete lack of concern struck him as familiar. Very familiar. He was about to find out just how familiar when the sliding door to his neighbor's house opened and Karen Whitmore stepped onto her deck. "Madison, honey, is everything okay over there?" Karen's voice carried across the property line with that particular tone Marcus had come to recognize over the past 3 years of living next to her. Sweet on the surface, but with an undertone that suggested she already knew exactly what was happening and approved of it entirely. Karen Whitmore was everything Marcus had learned to expect from Millbrook's elite social circle. Perfectly maintained blonde hair that cost more than most people's monthly salary, designer athleisure wear that she somehow made look formal, and an attitude that suggested the world existed solely for her convenience. Her husband's tech company success had bought them the largest house on the block, complete with a perfectly manicured lawn that she paid a crew to maintain twice weekly. "Some old guy is being totally rude to us, Mom," Madison called back, not even bothering to get out of Marcus a pool. She floated on an inflatable unicorn that probably cost more than his monthly water bill, her voice dripping with the same entitled disdain her mother had perfected. "He's acting like we're doing something wrong." Karen's expression shifted from concern to that familiar look Marcus had seen too many times during his career, the face of someone who believed their money and social status exempted them from basic rules of decency. She walked to the edge of her deck, looking down at Marcus with barely concealed irritation. "Excuse me, mister," she began, clearly not remembering his name despite their numerous previous encounters over property lines and noise complaints. "Rodriguez," Marcus replied evenly, though his patience was wearing thin. "And I think the more important question is why your daughter and her friends are trespassing on my property and destroying my backyard." Karen's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Oh, please. Madison and her friends are just enjoying summer break. They're good kids from good families. It's not like they're causing any real trouble." Marcus gestured to the chaos around them. Beer bottles glinted in the grass, his patio furniture had been rearranged without permission, and what looked like permanent marker graffiti was already appearing on his fence posts. The music continued to pound at a volume that was certainly violating the city's noise ordinances. Your daughter and her friends are trespassing, consuming alcohol while underage, destroying private property, and disturbing the peace, Marcus said, his voice taking on the professional tone he used when dealing with difficult suspects. This isn't summer fun. It's illegal. Madison finally looked up from her phone, rolling her eyes dramatically. God, you're being such a Karen about this. It's just a stupid pool. We'll be done soon. The irony of Madison calling him a Karen, while her actual mother stood there defending her behavior, wasn't lost on Marcus. But Karen's response was what truly amazed him. Look, Mr. Rodriguez, I understand you're upset, but these are exceptional young people. Madison has been accepted to Stanford, and most of her friends are honor students. They're not the kind of kids who cause real problems. Karen's voice carried that particular brand of privilege that assumed good grades and college acceptance letters were get-out-of-jail-free cards. Besides, Karen continued, warming to her theme, it's not like you were home to use the pool anyway. And frankly, this is the most life this little corner of the neighborhood has seen in years. Maybe you should be thanking them for bringing some energy to the area. Marcus felt his jaw clench. In his decades of police work, he dealt with plenty of entitled parents making excuses for their children's behavior, but Karen's complete dismissal of property rights and basic respect was breathtaking even by those standards. Mrs. Whitmore, your daughter and her friends are breaking multiple laws on my property. The fact that they're college-bound doesn't change that. Laws? Karen scoffed. Come on, don't be ridiculous. What are you going to do? Call the police because some teenagers use your pool? They'll laugh you off the phone. Do you have any idea how busy real police officers are with actual crimes? The teenagers in the pool had stopped splashing to watch the confrontation, sensing entertainment. Several were recording with their phones, no doubt planning to post the crazy neighbor freakout to their social media accounts. Madison had climbed out of the pool and was standing next to the speaker, her hand hovering over the volume controls with a smirk that suggested she was considering turning the music even louder. Look, Mr. Rodriguez, Karen said, adopting what she probably thought was a reasonable tone. Why don't we just let them finish up here? They'll clean up after themselves and everyone can go home happy. No need to make this into some big dramatic thing. Marcus looked around at the destruction, at the casual disrespect, at the complete lack of accountability from both mother and daughter. In his career, he'd seen how small acts of lawlessness grew into bigger problems when left unchecked. But more than that, he'd seen how entitled behavior, unvalidated by parents, created young adults who believed they were above consequences. It was time to introduce some consequences. Marcus reached into his back pocket and pulled out his leather wallet, extracting the gold badge that had been his constant companion for over 2 decades. He held it up where both Karen and Madison could see it clearly, along with all the teenagers who were still recording with their phones. Mrs. Whitmore, allow me to properly introduce myself. I'm Chief Marcus Rodriguez of the Millbrook Police Department, and your daughter and her friends are currently committing multiple felonies and misdemeanors on the property of a sworn law enforcement officer. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Madison's smirk vanished as if someone had flipped a switch. The inflatable unicorn she'd been leaning against drifted away forgotten as she scrambled out of the pool, suddenly very aware of her state of undress, and the beer bottle she'd been holding moments before. Several of the other teenagers began frantically trying to hide their drinks or dump them into the bushes, as if that would somehow erase the evidence of their underage drinking. Karen's face went through a remarkable transformation. The confident superiority she worn like armor just seconds before cracked and crumbled, replaced by a pale shock that made her expensive makeup suddenly look garish under the evening light. Her mouth opened and closed several times without sound, like a fish gasping for air. You're the police chief? She finally managed to stammer. 23 years on the force, 3 as chief. Marcus confirmed, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority. And in those 23 years, I've learned that how people behave when they think there are no consequences tells you everything you need to know about their character. The teenagers were no longer treating this as entertainment. Phones disappeared into pockets and purses as the reality of their situation began to sink in. These weren't just good kids having fun anymore. They were potential defendants in criminal proceedings, and their privileged backgrounds suddenly seemed like flimsy protection against the law. Madison looked desperately toward her mother, clearly expecting Karen to somehow fix the situation the way she probably fixed every other problem in her daughter's life. But Karen was staring at Marcus with growing horror as she realized exactly how badly she miscalculated. Chief Rodriguez, we didn't know. Madison didn't mean. Karen's usual articulate entitlement had devolved into stuttering fragments. Didn't mean to what exactly? Marcus asked calmly. Didn't mean to trespass. Didn't mean to consume alcohol while underage. Didn't mean to destroy private property, or did mean to show complete disrespect for the law and for other people's rights. He gestured to the chaos around them, the trampled grass, the scattered bottles, the graffiti on his fence, the expensive sound system that had been blasting music in violation of noise ordinances for who knows how long. Because from where I'm standing, this looks pretty intentional. And your response, Mrs. Whitmore, when I tried to address this civilly, was to tell me that I should be grateful for the destruction of my property. Madison finally found her voice, though it came out as a barely audible whisper. We can clean it up. We can pay for anything that's damaged. Please, I can't have an arrest record. Stanford will revoke my acceptance. The desperation in her voice was a stark contrast to the arrogant dismissal she'd shown just minutes before. Now she understood that actions had consequences, and those consequences could destroy the privileged future she'd taken for granted. That's interesting, Marcus said. A few minutes ago, I was just some old man you could dismiss. Now suddenly you're concerned about accountability. Several of the other teenagers had started quietly gathering their belongings, clearly hoping to slip away unnoticed. But Marcus's next words stopped them in their tracks. Nobody leaves until we sort this out. And I'll need to see identification from everyone who's been drinking. The request sent a new wave of panic through the group. These weren't anonymous partygoers anymore. They were individuals who could be identified, charged, and held responsible. Their parents would be called. Their schools would be notified. Their carefully constructed images of being good kids from good families would be put to the test. Karen seemed to rally slightly, falling back on the only strategy she knew. Chief Rodriguez, surely we can work this out reasonably. These are exceptional young people who made a mistake. Madison volunteers at the animal shelter, and her friend Trevor, their student body president. They're not criminals. Mrs. Whitmore, 20 minutes ago, you told me that real police officers were too busy with actual crimes to care about what your daughter was doing. You suggested I should be thanking her for bringing life to my property. Marcus's voice remained level, but there was steel underneath. Now you want to negotiate because you've realized I am one of those real police officers you were so confident would dismiss this. The teenagers stood frozen, caught between their instinct to flee and their fear of making things worse. Madison kept glancing at the gate, clearly calculating whether she could make it to her car before Marcus could stop her. But even in her panic, she seemed to understand that running from a police chief would only add to her problems. The question now, Marcus continued, is how we proceed from here. Because this stops being a neighborly dispute the moment I'd officially document what I've witnessed here tonight. Marcus pulled out his phone and began taking systematic photographs of the scene. The scattered beer bottles, the graffiti on his fence, the damaged lawn furniture, and the faces of every teenager present. Each click of the camera seemed to echo in the sudden silence, punctuated only by someone's nervous breathing and the distant hum of the expensive sound system that was still playing, though someone had frantically lowered the volume. Chief Rodriguez, please. Karen's voice had lost all its earlier confidence. What can we do to make this right? I'm sure we can handle this without making it official. Marcus looked at her steadily. Mrs. Whitmore, you had the opportunity to handle this 20 minutes ago when I asked politely for your daughter and her friends to leave my property. Instead, you told me I should be grateful for the privilege of having my home vandalized. Madison stepped forward, tears now streaming down her face, her earlier arrogance completely evaporated. Please, Chief Rodriguez, I know what we did was wrong. I'll do anything to make it right. I'll pay for all the damages, I'll do community service, I'll clean your pool every week for a year. Please don't arrest us. And what about Trevor over there? Marcus nodded toward a lanky teenager who was trying to hide behind the others. Student body president, right? What's his punishment going to be when the school board learns their student leader was arrested for underage drinking and trespassing? Trevor went visibly pale. Sir, please. I'm supposed to give the commencement speech next week. If this gets out, maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to break into someone's backyard. Marcus replied. Actions have consequences, Trevor. That's something student leaders should understand. Karen's desperation was now palpable. Chief, what if we made a substantial donation to the police department for new equipment or training? The Whitmore Foundation called. Are you attempting to bribe a police officer, Mrs. Whitmore? Marcus's voice cut through her suggestion like ice, because that would add felony charges to an already serious situation. The color drained completely from Karen's face. No, I didn't mean, I just thought. You thought your money could buy your way out of this, just like it's apparently bought your daughter out of every other consequence she's faced in her life. Marcus gestured toward Madison, who was now sobbing openly. Look at her, Mrs. Whitmore. This is the first time she's ever had to face real accountability, isn't it? Several neighbors had begun to emerge from their houses, drawn by the commotion and the sudden silence of the music. Mrs. Chen from across the street stood on her porch, arms crossed, watching the scene with obvious satisfaction. The Johnsons from 2 doors down were whispering to each other, clearly recognizing some of the teenagers from around the neighborhood. "Oh God," whispered one of Madison's friends, "people are watching. This is going to be all over Instagram by tomorrow." Marcus nodded toward the gathering neighbors. "That's right. This isn't happening in a vacuum. Your actions affect this entire community. Mrs. Chen over there has been dealing with noise from these parties for weeks. The Johnsons found beer bottles in their front yard last month. You've been treating this entire neighborhood like your personal playground." He pulled out his official notebook and began writing. "Let's see. We have trespassing, underage drinking, destruction of property, disturbing the peace, and based on the smell coming from behind that tree, probably marijuana possession as well." Several teenagers exchanged panicked glances. Madison looked like she might faint. "But here's what's going to happen," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the tone he used when addressing community meetings. "This is a teachable moment for everyone involved. Madison, you and every single one of your friends are going to clean up every piece of trash, scrub every mark off my fence, and restore my property to exactly the condition it was in before you decided to use it as your personal party venue." Relief flickered across several faces, but Marcus wasn't finished. "Then you're all going to report to the community center tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. sharp for 60 hours of community service. You'll be cleaning parks, helping at the senior center, and doing whatever other volunteer work I assign. And your parents will be accompanying you for the first day to see exactly what their children's harmless fun has cost this community." Karen opened her mouth to object, but Marcus held up a hand. "Furthermore, Mrs. Whitmore, since you seem so concerned about real police business, you'll be attending the next 3 city council meetings to observe exactly how seriously we take quality of life issues in this community. And you'll be publicly apologizing to this neighborhood for your family's behavior. But my reputation," Karen started. "Should have been a consideration before you decided to enable criminal behavior." Marcus cut her off. "Your reputation is going to survive a public apology a lot better than it would survive criminal charges against your daughter." Madison looked up through her tears. "And if we do all that, Stanford won't find out?" Marcus studied her for a long moment. "That depends entirely on whether you learn from this or whether this is just another problem you expect someone else to solve for you. Character isn't what you do when everyone's watching, Madison. It's what you do when you think no one will ever find out." The teenagers began the humiliating process of cleaning up the party debris under the watchful eyes of the gathering neighbors. Marcus supervised while texting his sergeant to expect some new community service volunteers, knowing this night would be talked about in Millbrook for months to come. The real question now was whether the lesson would stick or whether Madison and her mother would simply find new ways to avoid consequences once the immediate crisis passed. 3 months later, Marcus was tending to his garden on a quiet Saturday morning when he heard the familiar sound of his pool filter running. But instead of the usual irritation such sounds might have once brought, he smiled. Madison Whitmore was there right on schedule, just as she had been every Saturday for the past 12 weeks, meticulously cleaning his pool and maintaining his backyard. The transformation had been remarkable, though not without its struggles. The first few weeks had been predictably rocky. Karen had initially tried to hire a cleaning service to fulfill Madison's obligations, prompting a stern phone call from Marcus that made it clear the consequences were non-negotiable and non-transferable. She then attempted to have the family's lawyer explore whether Marcus had overstepped his authority, only to discover that everything he required was well within his purview as both a property owner and a police officer. But the real turning point had come during the 3rd week of community service, when Madison was assigned to help at the senior center. Marcus had specifically chosen this assignment after observing how dismissive she'd been toward him that first night, calling him an old man as if his age somehow diminished his worth. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, an 87-year-old former teacher, had taken one look at Madison's sullen attitude and apparent assumption that community service was beneath her and had put her to work reading to residents with vision problems. At first, Madison had struggled through the task with obvious impatience, but gradually something had shifted. "Chief Rodriguez," Madison said now, looking up from the pool skimmer, "Mrs. Patterson asked me to tell you that her granddaughter got into the police academy. She wanted you to know because she says you're the reason she applied." Marcus paused in his weeding. "How's that?" "She heard about what you did with us, how you could have ruined our lives but chose to teach us instead. It inspired her to want to serve the community too." Madison's voice carried a sincerity that would have been unimaginable 3 months ago. "Mrs. Patterson says you showed her what real leadership looks like." The change in Madison had been gradual but unmistakable. The community service had connected her with people whose lives bore no resemblance to her privileged bubble. She'd serve meals to families struggling to make ends meet, clean parks in neighborhoods where children couldn't afford private pools, and listen to stories from seniors who'd built their communities through decades of service rather than inheritance. "How's Stanford preparation going?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious. Good. Better than good, actually. Madison carefully cleaned the pool equipment before storing it properly. I changed my major. I was going to study business, but now I want to go into social work. My parents weren't thrilled at first, but they're coming around. The transformation in Karen had been even more dramatic, though it had taken a very public wake-up call to achieve it. Her appearance at the city council meetings had initially been perfunctory. She clearly expected to sit quietly in the back and fulfill her obligation with minimal engagement. But the first meeting had featured a presentation on the city's youth programs, and Karen had been forced to confront how little she knew about the community she lived in for over a decade. By the third meeting, she was asking questions. By the sixth, she volunteered to chair a committee addressing youth services. The woman who had once dismissed community concerns as beneath her attention was now spearheading initiatives to provide constructive activities for teenagers across all economic levels. Mom's actually enjoying her committee work, Madison continued as if reading his thoughts. She's organizing a summer program for kids who can't afford camp. She says she wishes she'd gotten involved years ago. Marcus nodded, not entirely surprised. He'd seen this pattern before. People who seemed irredeemably selfish often simply needed to be connected with something larger than themselves. Karen's entitlement had been, in many ways, a product of isolation from the real world. And your friends? How are they adjusting? Most of them learned from it. Trevor's actually running for student government again next year, but this time his platform is about accountability and service. A couple of the others, Madison shrugged. Their parents try to transfer them to private schools to avoid the embarrassment. I guess some people need harder lessons than others. Marcus had heard through official channels about the parents who tried to have him investigated for harassment or abuse of power. The complaints had been dismissed quickly. Marcus had followed every protocol perfectly, and the results spoke for themselves. Property crime in the neighborhood had dropped significantly, and several of the teenagers involved had become regular volunteers at community organizations. Chief Rodriguez, Madison said, carefully replacing the pool cover, I need to apologize to you. Not just for the party, but for how I treated you that night. I called you an old man like it was an insult, like your experience and knowledge didn't matter. That was ignorant and disrespectful. Apology accepted, Marcus replied. But more importantly, what did you learn from it? Madison was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking carefully about her answer. I learned that respect isn't something you earn through money or status. It's something you give to others because they're human beings deserving of dignity. And I learned that real consequences aren't punishments, they're opportunities to become better people. 6 months later, Marcus received a letter from Madison at Stanford. She'd been elected to student government on a platform of community service and was working with local organizations to address homelessness in the area. She'd also started a mentorship program pairing college students with at-risk youth. The letter included a photo of her and Karen volunteering together at a food bank, both wearing matching volunteer t-shirts and genuinely happy smiles. Karen had enclosed her own note thanking Marcus for showing them both that privilege came with responsibility, and that true leadership meant lifting others up rather than looking down on them. But perhaps the most meaningful acknowledgement came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Chen from across the street knocked on his door one evening with a homemade apple pie and a simple message. Thank you for showing us that justice doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like giving people the chance to become who they're supposed to be. As Marcus sat on his back patio that evening looking out at his perfectly maintained pool and peaceful neighborhood, he reflected on the lesson that had emerged from that chaotic July night. Real authority wasn't about the power to punish, it was about the wisdom to know when consequences could become catalysts for transformation. Sometimes the most profound justice wasn't found in courtrooms or jail cells, but in the moment when entitled teenagers learned empathy, when privileged parents discovered purpose, and when a community came together to ensure that everyone, regardless of their background, understood that actions have consequences, but those consequences could lead to redemption. In the end, that was the kind of policing Marcus had always believed in, and the kind of leadership that actually changed lives.